absolute maximum, the presentation. There's a bit to cover, and there's some material we're just not going to be able to cover in relation to this presentation. So we're just trying to keep to the basics and to provide enough information to generate a discussion at the end of the presentation. But in short, we are celebrating our first dedicated empirical effort in understanding deliberative reasoning using the Deliberative Reasoning Index, which has been a long time coming. I'll give you a bit of a potted history about it in a second. But what we're going to present today is a little bit of information about what deliberative reasoning is and what it purports to measure, with a little bit of a connection to deliberative theory and sort of a defense of the approach, and the history whereby the approach has been developed. And very quickly, we're going to very briefly cover the way it's measured. There's a couple of moving parts here, but that's going to be a very small part of the presentation. And then the main part of the presentation is going to cover the meta-analysis that we have performed, well, mainly Francesco. So at that point, Francesco is going to take over much of the conversation to explain the results. And the intention has been to try and understand what improves deliberative reasoning as we measure it. And the results have been very interesting for us. And we're going to be really interested to see what you have to say about the results and the interpretation, so we can proceed quickly to writing this up. So without further ado, I'm going to give you a bit of a history here. Like I said, this has been a long time coming. A few of us have been around since the beginning. I think Mark Warren's one of the first people I showed this effect to. John has certainly been around since the beginning. Graham Smith is coming to the second edition of this seminar we're going to give, because he says, well, I was there from the start. I've got to see this through. But the story starts about almost 20 years ago. I actually went through my files this morning to look at the first file I created to analyze what is called interesteffective consistency, upon which the deliberative reasoning index is based. And what drove me to this approach was, as part of my PhD 20 years ago, I wanted to understand what happens during deliberative reasoning and how can we account for it empirically, and how can we account for it in a way which is consistent with what we might understand, how we might understand deliberative theory. And I ranged around literature quite a bit to find ways of approaches to this, and went across all sorts of theories, including A.N. Fishbein, theory of planned action, and so on. And I was very attracted to the approach where you look at changes on different levels. One in this case, one is the level of considerations, what we now call considerations in deliberative theory, in terms of what needs to be weighed in terms of making our decisions. And then the next level in terms of what we decide in terms of the actions and the relationship between the two. And when I did my first case study, the Bloomfield track 20 years ago, it was when I looked at the data, when I surveyed attitudes in relation to considerations versus policy preferences, the thing that really stood out that this was a very polarized and politicized issue. And when you looked at attitudes, there was a lot more consensus than what you would think when you looked at the level of preferences. And so this seemed inconsistent. So why do we have so much disagreement in relation to what we think should be done, where there's a lot of basic agreement on all the relevant considerations? Environmental values is the classic example, where everyone agrees that environment is important, and Tim's heard me say this before as well. So what goes wrong in terms of creating that disjuncture, and what does deliberation do to correct it? So what I did is, I just out of intuition, it occurred to me that if we plot agreement amongst pairs of individuals on their attitudes to these considerations against their agreement on preferences, we should be able to get a sort of understanding of this. And this is that very first plot. And you can see from this plot that when you look at preferences, there's a lot of difference in terms of high levels of agreement at the top, measured as a correlation on their survey preferences, and to high levels of disagreement, almost perfect disagreement at the bottom of the chart. Whereas in terms of attitudes, there was a tendency towards higher levels of agreement. So this is pre-deliberation. And then when you look at the situation post-deliberation, this is what we get. And a lot of you have seen this animation before. This is the effect. we get a movement towards what is called intersubjective consistency, where levels of agreement on preferences is consistent with levels of agreement on attitudes to considerations, and vice versa for levels of disagreement. So that's where all this started. And there's been a lot of qualitative work in understanding those processes and actually triangulating it with its empirical results over the last 20 years to develop the theory and then develop the method. And it was only recently that we could really kick this analysis along with the arrival of Francesco to help out with the empirical, the refinement of the method in terms of how to aggregate and analyze all these results. So that's where it starts. And since then, we've collected a lot more data that we can ground proof the method and its implications. So the theory of this, and this is going to be a very, very quick version, there's actually a working paper that covers this on our working paper series, which does need some updating. But in very, very quick terms, what the method does is look at level of considerations, as I mentioned, and the relationship between preferences for different policy actions. And that space between is what the theory calls deliberative reason. Now, there's a relationship with the theories of meta-consensus that John and I have developed previously. I won't get into that now. It was only recently that I managed to sort of connect with John in terms of what that relationship is, but that has to be developed and explicated fairly quickly as well. And the empirical data that we use to analyze this is surveyed attitudes in relation to considerations. The approach is based on Q methodology, which I won't get into here, but we are developing it so it can be implemented as a straightforward, Likert scale survey. There's a bit of development work to be done there. And then on the other end of the scale, we actually analyze policy preferences as rank ordered preferences for a series of policy options. Francesco and I are writing a long-awaited book chapter for Selene in her Oxford book on delivery methods, where we will actually expand on the methods for actually gathering this data and analysing it. So measuring intersubjective consistency, it is very simply, on one level, we look at all combinations of pairs of individuals and we look at their distance apart in terms of their attitudes on considerations, and how that corresponds to their agreement on policy preferences. So we have 3 individuals here, which actually produces 2 data points in terms of intersubjective consistency. So this is the plotting of those distances, whereas the red-blue pair are consistent, the blue and purple pair is less consistent. And what DRI does is actually aggregates all those distances into a single measure, which we won't get into the details thereof, but to the extent that all the points converge on that 45-degree line, the theory is that it represents a shared understanding in terms of what issues are important for meta-consensus, and there's an integration of all those considerations into reasoning, and there's a sort of set of theoretical steps which connects those to the ideals of deliberation. Francesco and I have also worked on a formalization of this, which needs a bit more work, but we're going to release that at some point as well. Okay, so like I said, the DRI is an aggregation of that, and what we've done is normalize that to a -1 to 1 scale. And in practical terms, a 1 is perfect sort of agreement, perfect consistency in terms of convergence on that 45-degree line. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's agreement, but there's consistent disagreement to the extent that disagreement occurs. A score of -1 is almost impossible to achieve. You would actually have to be belligerent in terms of your reasoning to disagree on terms of attitudes, but agree on preferences. A measure of 0 is basically random. So any result that is less than 0 reflects often a very, very highly polarized situation. And that was the case for the Bloomfield track. It was slightly negative, that sort of result, but it's very unusual to get a result less than 0. It's important to note that this is a group level phenomenon. It's an emergent property from a group. It's not a measure that can be measured a priori. It doesn't actually tell you what the reason is, although that can be extracted from the data. It just reflects the fact that there is a form of agreement in terms of the way the group thinks about the issue, reflecting, again, a set of deliberative ideals which are outlined in the theory paper. So our argument is that this is a proxy, if you like, for an ideal deliberative situation. Danica Floyce would actually object to the idea that we're saying that this is an outcome. It's not necessarily an outcome. It doesn't have substantive content itself, but it reflects a situation where there is a shared reason or shared reasoning, a result of a reasoning process as a group. Okay, I think that's enough in the theory. We'll move along quickly to the meta-analysis. If there's any questions about the theory, we can sort of move those into the discussion, perhaps. So we developed the method. We have a metric for analysing it now, and I've collected data over a 20-year period. And Len, you've been involved in collecting one of the case study data, the Fremantle Bridge. I think a lot of people who are going to be attending maybe the European version of this presentation have actually been present for the collection of a lot of this data. But there's 20 cases as part of 10 studies. A few of those studies involve multiple cases with shared instrument sets that we've collected together for the analysis. This is a distribution of the cases. They're across different countries, mainly in Australia, one in Italy, a couple in the US, Canada, and I'd love to get into the details of them all, but we just don't have time, unfortunately. But the important thing here is that there's a fair bit of variation in terms of the design in these cases that has permitted us to actually perform an analysis of different designs of deliberation, minipublic deliberation, and their effects on deliberative reasoning. As for the variables, I guess I'll hand over to Francesco.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so my task here is to present the analysis and the results. So we decided to run a multi-level regression in order to identify which variable better explain the RI change. So our dependent variable is deliberative reasoning index change, which refer to the individual deliberative reason between the pre and the post deliberation. So we have two types of variables. The variables that have an individual level, so that characterize each participant, and the cluster variable that characterize the group level.
Or case study.
Or the case study, yeah. So the minipublic, so it characterizes the minipublic.
Yes.
Let's see. So at the individual level, we have mainly the arise or the outcome, but as well we have mainly demographic variables. So gender, age, education, female, male, different age, and high level and low level education. At the minipublic level, we have group building norm, which capture what type of group process has been used to build group norm and group identity, such as cognitive training exercise, group development, where participants work through what norm should apply during the process, group briefing during plenary session, or formal or just introduction or no group work at all. Decision output, or that's the way participants express their preference, whether across formal ballot, informal ballot.
Just in terms of group building, it's probably worth pointing out that the standard approach in terms of deliberative design is to provide a group briefing where someone stands up and tells participants what deliberation looks like. So we tend to cluster, you'll see in a minute, we actually have, without group building, there are sort of group briefing and less. And group building, when we actually sort of bifurcate the variable, involves group development, which actually involved a group discussion in terms of deliberative norms. So the facilitator in those cases said, okay, how should we behave? The group discussed that. They agreed on how norms of behavior, and there was, sort of self-regulation of deliberative norms within the group from there. Cognitive training actually involved that process plus some mindfulness training. So just to give you some context there. So sorry, Francesco.
Yeah, no worries. So we have a decision output. So the way participants express their preference. So we can have formal ballots, such voting, or direct voting, informal ballots, or towards group statements. The prospective decision impact, or that's
so decision output. So there's a bit of a story behind this that's worth conveying, is that we actually stumbled upon this almost by accident, that this might be a feature, is that the way you structure a decision impacts on the deliberative process. Now, Kimmo, Gronlund, Meyer, Settler have actually analysed this using group statement versus a ballot. So they actually had a sort of a first go at analysing meta-consensus, if you like, via a treatment effect. And they found knowledge gains were higher for the group statement process. But when observing a process in Italy, we had a situation where a facilitator actually departed from the script and decided to implement a vote in the middle of the process. And I don't understand Italian, but it was just obvious to me, even from the body language, that this process shut down. Deliberation was effectively over. So it occurred to us from observing that there was a potentially interesting relationship between structuring a decision as a vote versus a group statement that we've analysed here in this study.
Yeah. So the prospective decision impact, or that how does the deliberative process impact decision making? So whether it is decisive and the outcome is implemented as direct decision, or whether it is as just an advisory, informal, or no impact tool, such as for research purposes only. We have issue complexity. Here we capture, I would say, complexity dimension of issue, considering geographical proximity, politicization, and the scientific complexity. And finally, we have length, so the duration in days of the minipublic deliberative process. So as it's possible to observe, our data set is very complex. On the one hand, we have a different level of variables at the individual, at the group, and the time level as well, so different period, moment of the deliberative process. And on the other hand, we have a very heterogeneous effect on DRI at the case level. So just
So we'll move on.
So before to comment the results of the analysis, I would like to show some example on how variable works at the aggregated level, so the whole sample, and at the mini-public level. So for example, for example, by looking here, we have the variable group building norm. So on the left, we have a high level group building.
So that's the data from all those studies that involve 4 or 5 on the group building scale.
And on the right, we have the 1, 2, 3 group building scale. So the standard relation. So just to show the animation, how does it work?
And we've got to show you this because Francesco spent a lot of time getting this animation together. And then we spent a lot of time editing this to make it work yesterday. So we have to show you this animation.
So as we see, cases with high level of group building on the left, the blue dots, we say, have a higher level of DRI in the post-deliberation. That is observable because they are aggregated across the diagonal line. And in contrast, this pattern is not observable with, between a non-group building norm. Basically, the aggregation pattern is between pre and post, they're basically the same, similar. So,
which we'll see at the end, of course, when we get to the meta study.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, here is, I would say, is the same aggregated effect we can observe through, I would say, case level, so mini-public level. So
this is the same data you just saw, but broken down by individual mini-public case.
So just show the animation. So so
should we show it again in case you didn't see it the first time?
Yeah.
It's worth showing. Again, we spent a lot of time getting this done, so let's show you again. So here we go. We're going to try and find a way to get these on the website so people can just sort of come in and play with them themselves.
So yeah, on the left screen we have the high level group building, and on the right screen we have the low level group building. And we see that the same pattern on the aggregated level is visible here, is observable as well here. So in the, I would say, high level group building norm, we have the trend to gather the point to be clustered around diagonal, and the other case not. It's kind of more dispersed across the plot. So here the variable is clearly, we expect, I would say, a significant effect on the DRI from group building.
Which we'll analyze statistically now.
Yeah, and
oh yes, before, after I talk.
Yeah, before, yes. Well, we have other variable which pattern are not so clear. Here, for example, we have a graph that reveals the impact of the level of education. So that graph refers to a normal regression analysis, which show say significance between high-level educated people in predicting a high level of DRI in the post-deliberation.
A high level of DRI improvement.
DRI improvement. However, when we look at the specific case, this pattern result to be less clear. Indeed, as displayed in the second graph, we have a very high level of heterogeneity of the variable education on DRI change. For example, for Sierra and Mayo biobanking, we have a low level of education is associated with high level of DRI, which is not the case of all the cases. So this heterogeneity is not really representative for a specific pattern. Here, context-based or idiosyncratic factor might play an important role.
And because we've observed most of these studies, and this is the beauty about this particular meta-study, we've been involved in just about all of them ourselves, it's possible, it's quite clear what is going on in those individual cases in relation to gender, to do with composition or particular selection factors. But what we haven't managed to do is find a sort of a variable that captures all that. So the point is that there's a lot of variability in effects in terms of demographics, which would require a bit more work to fully understand. It's complex.
Yeah, that's why, so this data heterogeneity and the nested nature of the variable between group, individual, and time levels justify the use of multi-level regression. That's what we show the results now, actually. Yeah. So the analysis. In general, we have an improvement between stages. So the pre-stage is generally lower than post-stages. So part of the variation of the DRI is the variation is explained by the stage differences. And so we have a 0.1 something improvement in average between.
I told Francesco I was going to annoy the crap out of him by sort of piping up every now and then. But the interpretation here is that some form of deliberation helps to improve reasoning. Yeah.
So at an individual level, now I run everything.
Oh, well.
Anyway, demographic variables do not play a role in explaining the variance DRI. So this result can be interpreted in two different ways. One is linked to, I would say, kind of methodological limitation, such respect through different methodological approaches. As we are thinking structural equation modeling, we might find other effects that multi-level analysis does not pick up, such as possible mediation effect. The other explanation is linked to the great heterogeneity of this variable. As mentioned before, in such a respect, we have a contextual idiosyncratic factor that might provide better explanation on the role of the demographic variable. For example, gender imbalance of deliberating groups, cultural and structural differences, emphasizing anomaly in education or self-selection bias.
Yeah. So the thing is, we think there is a demographic story to tell, but the other thing that we think is coming out in this analysis is that there is not necessarily a confounding effect, but effect we're not picking up, which probably is explained by self-selection, which we'll get to in the discussion here. But I guess we'll go through each of the group level effects.
Now I'm going the case variable level. So at the group level, the most important variable is group building norm. So group building norm is the most important predictor of the analysis, which is positively and significantly associated with high level of deliberative reason change. And it explains most of the DRI variance. So it's 0.41 of the fixed effect.
Yes, and we're very proud of the amount of variance that these models explain. So we're getting anywhere between 50% and was it 80%? So 85% in the final one, the explanation of the variance in deliberative reasoning using this model.
So in contrast to the other one, issue complexity, decision output, and decision impact, if I would say a negative effect on DRI change. So the more the issue is complex, the more, or I would say, the less DRI the more DRI is going down, I would say. And the same for decision output. So the way how you express your reference.
The more we move towards ballot versus the group statement, deliberate reasoning is negatively impacted.
And decision impact as well. So the role of decision making. So when we have a high level of decision making, we also have lower level of DRI change. Here, a possible explanation might be a self-selection bias that might create an imbalanced presence of individual motivated by the opportunity to directly influence the decision making on the pod. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're not quite sure whether the very fact that this is a high impact process changes the internal dynamics, or whether the impact is actually via a self-selection. If you actually advertise the process as having a big impact, there's some evidence, Julia Enstall's done this, I think Sophie Marianne's done a bit of this as well, is that there's actually a self-selection of personality types that tend to want to be dominant in a process and not engage deliberatively. So teasing out those effects is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. So a second level analysis to refer to the interaction analysis. So in this case, we analyze conditions that enhance or reduce the effect size of other conditions. So put simply, by using a heuristic terminology, interaction works like food and condiments. So if we know that food play a role in satisfaction, we also know that condiment play a greater role in enhances the level of satisfaction of food. So in similar way, here we aim to individuate which condition enhance or reduce the power or the effect of another condition. Yeah. So in the table, we display the interaction analysis. Yeah.
So did you want to use the cursor to show the results?
I think it's all right. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's all right. Okay. So what we can say is we have a clear interaction between issue complexity and group building norm across the model represented here. So it's actually maybe the cursor is easy. Here.
So can everyone see the cursor on the screen here? Does it work?
So yeah. Okay. Essentially, with a level of group building norm, issue complexity does not have a negative effect on the array anymore. However, we also observe that length here in the model 2-3 as a confounding effect with this interaction. This is very interesting because we can observe that the interaction between group building and issue complexity is stronger when length is included in the model. Yeah. This clearly suggests that length play a role together with group building in mitigating the negative effect of issue complexity.
Yeah, so I guess the interpretation there is that even though we don't get an overall effect of length, when it comes to certain cases, such as complex issues and where they have sort of high decision impact, I think, the argument that deliberation takes time does actually take hold. I mean, the argument that the length is a factor does play in the analysis. It just doesn't come out in the main analysis.
Yeah. Okay, to be clear in the interaction here, we reproduce a plot representing the interaction between issue complexity and group building. So with low level of issue complexity, the slope of the line is practically flat. So this shows that DRI level change are similar for low and high level of group building.
So when an issue is low complexity, group building doesn't make that much difference.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's always kind of high in a way. Yeah. However, here we observe a clear negative effect of complex issue on the RI score only when they are discussed between deliberative process with minimal or limited group building norm. This is not the case for a high level of a group building norm, in which complex issues do not have a negative effect on the RI. Essentially, group building wash out the negative effect of issue complexity.
Yeah, so the other end of the scale, when an issue is very complex, has very high complexity, if you don't have group building, there's actually a chance, according to the model, that reasoning can deteriorate rather than improve.
Yeah. Another interaction has been debated between decision impact, so the decision-making role, and issue complexity. Here we have, I would say, a crossover interaction in which, for simpler issues, the role of decision-making no longer has a negative impact on the RI, while the trend is reversed with high level of decision-making. Considering, I would say, the heuristic example of food and condiment with high level of decision-making and high level of issue complexity, it's like having mustard on ice cream. So the same is for low level and of issue complexity and low impact on decision making. While so it suppresses the condition predicting powers. In contrast with low level decision making and high level of issue complexity, is more like having chocolate on ice cream. So it's enhancing a bit the power of the condition.
And you can all rate Francesco's food analogies in the comments page later on. and to see just and in terms of how they work. But yeah, we'll move on.
Yeah. Okay. Finally, here we have, I would say, the proper meta-analysis on the effect size magnitude. In this case, we tested the effect size on the level of heterogeneity of group building norm by calculating the standard mean difference, which is the measure used in the meta-analysis usually. So the standard mean difference of DRI change between pre and post deliberation across cases with the group of high level, I would say, group building norm, and the group with a low level group building norm. So on the left, we have low level, and on the right, the high level. So considering standardized mean difference, we observe a small effect size on the DRI change with cases with low level of group building norm, and a huge effect size across cases with high level of group building norm. This considering that, so here that is 0.4 and that is 1.34. So that's the average effect size. This considering that anyway, the effect size in the literature, the meta-analysis is considered big when it's above 0.8. So with 1.34 is is huge, I guess, and it's considered small when it's below 0.5.
Yeah, so I mean, the story here is, despite the fact we don't have, I mean, by meta-study standards, we don't have a huge number of cases and a huge number of individuals. I think it's something like 500 individuals in this space. We get a very, very strong effect size on this analysis. We still have to repeat this analysis for the other main findings in relation to group building and decision output. Decision output and decision impact. But certainly in relation to group building, the effect at a meta-study level is very, very strong.
Yeah, sorry, just, so another, we ran another analysis in relation to this meta level. I would say, I would have to spend a couple of words on heterogeneity and the effect size. So when we calculate a parameter which define the effect size variation in meta-analysis, in this case we observe that a moderate level of heterogeneity of the effect size across cases that have a high level of group building. In contrast, we have a high level of heterogeneity of the effect size for cases with low level of group building. This indicates that the main source of variation, the DRI change within the cluster of group building cases, can be explained by group building variable itself, and which is not the case for the cluster of low level of group building norm. So in a way, this analysis corroborates the results presented before, which indicate a negative role of other variables on the DRI, such as issue complexity, decision making, and decision output. And yeah.
Okay, and this is the last slide. Okay, I'll just go through this very quickly. So this has been a very, very quick just overview of the method and the meta study. There is actually a report available for this, which we can provide a link to those of you who haven't already seen it. It's a bit coarse and a bit rough. We're going to update that very quickly and line out some of the bumps and make it available. But just some quick reflections on the findings overall and where to from here. So the first one is the performance of DRI itself. So we're very pleased in terms of the overall performance of the metric. Now, that's a different question about it being theoretically defensible, which I think it is. That's work to be done elsewhere. But in terms of explaining design impacts, it performs extremely well.
Definitely capture the building.
Now, so there's a few big questions that come out of this, and one is how we actually think about deliberation. And there's emerging literature on the roles for emotions, ideas around deliberative stance, and Graham Smith is coming to the European version of our seminar next week. Do we need to reconceptualize deliberations that are a bit more formally in terms of not just being a process? And Andre Baktica is actually going to be a co-author on this paper before we submit in the submitted version. And Mark, we've got to talk to you about your interest as well. Mark Oren is a member of the meta-study project as well. But what are the implications for how we think about deliberation in terms of building in a sort of an emotional context versus actually a process? There's some really interesting implications from these findings in terms of those downstream impacts. And then there's the practical design implications associated with this. And so, we've talked about group building quite a lot in terms of, it featuring as a design in minipublics. And it does bring into question, and Marina Lindell actually raised this question in a meta-analysis of her own some years ago, which questioned the idea, the common assertion that decision-making is really important for a deliberative process. And these results obviously bring that into question from the perspective of deliberative reasoning. But we don't say this is the only way to measure deliberation, but if your objective is deliberative reasoning as defined, then we need to do some thinking about that, or have processes that buttress the potential negative effects of focusing around a vote. But it does actually question the idea, the basic model of talk then vote for deliberation. Need some thinking there. It also brings into question the claims about representation. Now, this isn't a direct finding, but when we write this up, it becomes clear that some of the effects appear to be associated with self-selection on the basis of attitudes, personality type, rather than demographics. And so, John Dryzek and I have obviously written about discursive representation and representing attitudes versus demographics. And this tends to potentially bear that out, the importance of that approach, rather than making representative claims on the basis just of demographics. We've got a bit of work to do in terms of firming up some of the findings, and Francesco has mentioned he's very keen to do a path analysis where we're actually have a sort of a path structure and do some structural equation modeling in terms of the results. And also in the future, as we develop this, Nicole and I have written a project which didn't get up, but it prosecutes an agenda that we'd like to follow, which expands the application of this beyond minipublics to sort of system-wide features, to implement a sort of a standardized survey set across different jurisdictions, countries, to actually look at levels of sort of reasoning within those contexts and see if we can sort of cross-correlate those with other measures and potentially institutional settings to understand those broader dynamics. So that's ideally where this whole analysis is going. That's the 40 minutes. So we'll close up there and open for questions. So thank you.